So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dan Jolowicz, who is an expert in Greek language and literature. We're very lucky to have him here at King's. And he has kindly agreed to speak to us today on the topic of Greek theatre. So Dan, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here. Okay, let me just try and share my screen in the first instance. So I'm hoping you can see a PowerPoint presentation. James or Anna, if you could just confirm that you can see it, and then...
Yeah, that's all worked well.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Well, I can start in earnest in that case. Okay, well, as you can see from the title, I'm going to talk for the next half an hour, 45 minutes or so, on aspects of the archaeological and social context of ancient Greek theatre. Apologies for how vague that sounds. What I hope I'm going to talk about will be of some interest to those who are engaging with the Class Civ A-level syllabus. I'm going to talk. I mean, the word context in the title is probably the important one. I'm going to talk for a little bit about what we mean by performance. So ancient Greek, certainly 5th and 4th century BC, Athens as a performance culture, and what we mean by performance, of which obviously the plays that we're studying, so Bacchae, Oedipus, Tyrannus, and the Frogs. These are modes of performance, but I'd just like to, for the first sort of 10 minutes or so, interrogate what we mean by performance. It sounds like a self-evident sort of category of human behavior. We perform something on stage and then dash off and live our everyday lives. Yeah, what I'd like to interrogate and challenge that as a concept, and see why performance is such an important sort of category to think about in connection with the ancient Greek theatre. I'd then like to talk for a little bit about the distinction between experiencing an ancient Greek play as a performance versus how we might encounter these phenomena when studying them. So, for example, in a textbook or in a book, in a classroom, or what have you, and what difference that makes to our experience of ancient Greek drama, namely whether we experience it as a performance or as a text. I'll then move on to looking at some of the types of evidence that we have for ancient Greek drama. So, for example, the literary, the texts themselves, the literary evidence, but also some of the contextual evidence. So masks, the iconographic evidence that we have surviving in, for example, some vases, mosaics, for example, and obviously the archaeological evidence itself, the remains of ancient theatres. And then I'll end by looking a little bit about the theatre of Dionysus at Athens itself, and the festival of the city Dionysia, and some of the institutional sort of scaffolding and apparatus that festival goers would have encountered when they went to watch, for example, the Bacchae or Oedipus Tyrannus. And I'd just like to sort of throughout, I'd like us to think about what do we need to know? Do we need to know about this context in order to appreciate the plays? I mean, how important is the context when we read the text of these plays as texts? Do we really need to know the social archaeological context? Well, my answer is yes, we do. And what I'd like to try and do over the next 45 minutes or so is sketch some of that context. Okay, so first slide. What do we mean by performance? Well, I suppose we could describe performance as a communicative act, i.e. performance is something that an individual communicates to another individual or group of individuals. I suppose that's a sort of simple way of sort of defining what performance is. But then we might ask whether...
Dan,
Hello?
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Is the second slide supposed to be up now?
Yes. Yes,
We're
it is.
still on the first slide.
Ah,
I wonder
okay.
if you click play from start. Ah, there we go. And if you click sort of play from start, so we're into a slideshow, that might work.
Okay, I was actually doing that. So if that's not working, what I'll do is I'll keep the screen like this. And to avoid spoilers, just look at the slide we're meant to be looking at rather than the subsequent ones, maybe, if we want to avoid spoilers. But I'll carry on in this mode then, in that case.
Great. Yeah, that's fine. We can see that. We see the second slide now. Thank
Fantastic.
you. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, so performance is a communicative act. But then if performance is a communicative act, we might ask whether it's any type of communicative act. Is me talking on Zoom to you a type of performance, or is it just just any type of another type of communicative act? Well, one way of thinking about what performance is, rather than just categorizing it as a communicative act generally, is to say that it is a type of communicative act that focuses on the process of perception. And what I mean by that is it's a communicative act whose aesthetic qualities are at stake in a way that is greater than in other forms of communicative acts. So when we have a conversation with someone, we're not maybe advertising the aesthetic qualities of the conversation, whereas when the Bacchae is being performed on stage, the performers are asking the audience to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of that performance as a communicative act. So Greek drama is a very good example of thinking about how performance is a communicative act whose aesthetic qualities are being sort of advertised. I mean, I guess there's another problem with even if we narrow down performance as a communicative act whose aesthetic qualities are being brought into focus, there's still the problem that this is a really, really inclusive term and doesn't necessarily narrow things down too much for us. We still, for example, have, you know, music, dance, theatre, and all other types of performance art would be characterized as performative communicative acts. But the point of this slide is just that we can sort of get thinking about get thinking in a more sort of self-critical way about what we mean by performance, rather than necessarily as approaching it as a sort of self-evident category of human behavior. Okay, next slide. So Greek culture as a performance culture. Well, I mean, certainly ancient Athens of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, so the period that we're interested in as the sort of heyday of Greek drama, if you like, has often been described as a performance culture, and it's a concept that's integral to Greek culture, as I've said here. And this I think can be linked. I mean, people might disagree with this, but I think that certainly 5th and 4th century BC Athens as a performance culture can be linked quite specifically to the political institution that obtains in that culture, namely democracy. I think democracy is very important when thinking about Athens as a performance culture. Why is this the case? Well, democracy requires what we would call persuasion. Persuasion is a really, really important term here. What is persuasion? Well, it's what is democracy? It's when an individual needs to gather together the assembled polis, the assembled citizens, and persuade them about something. Why is this so important in a democracy? Well, in a tyranny, for example, you don't need to persuade anyone of anything. You can just tell them what to do, and you don't need to explain reasons why. You don't need to sort of perform your argument in any type of way. But democracy requires a performative mode of speech, a rhetorical mode of speech. So in this instance, I'd say that 5th and 4th century BC Athens is a performance culture, mainly because it's a democracy. So things like politics require persuasion. Things like politics require performance, and politicians need to be good actors, and that's why I've got pictures of, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Ronald Reagan. These are, of course, two very good examples of actors who became very successful politicians. But my point here, the broader point here, is that performance and politics, as it exists in a democracy, are two intertwined, inextricable concepts. Okay, on to the next slide. I shan't go through all of these performance modes and genres and contexts, but I just wanted to offer a slide that showed how integral performance as a category of behavior was in the ancient Greek world. So not all of this applies to 5th century necessarily, but certainly, the ancient Greek world as a general category, there were many different contexts and modes in which humans would have to perform things. So if we look at, for example, where I put some context, dinner parties or symposia, religious festivals, competitions, law courts. These were all contexts in which people had to perform things. So I guess the point I'm making here is that that ancient Greek drama, when people go and watch ancient Greek drama in the 5th or 4th century BC, this is not a isolated instance of performance. This was part of a set of behaviors that were all performative and that made up what we call a performance culture. Okay, on to the next slide. Performance and anthropology. Well, so why is performance? Clearly, performance is a very important category in the ancient Greek world. Well, modern anthropologists have some theories as to why that's the case. And social sciences and anthropology, in fact, see many aspects of human life and behavior in terms of performance and performativity. So again, this goes back to this question about whether performance is something that happens on stage and then you run off to your everyday life and you're no longer performing things. Well, social science and anthropology would actually say no. Performance is something that is integral to all aspects of human behavior. So types of social events like initiation rites, weddings, funerals. The anthropologist called Victor Turner described societal behavior as a type of social drama. I mean, the word drama there, I think, is really important. It's this idea that anything we do in a societal context is done in a performative mode. And then the performance of social interactions in order to give off certain impressions. So this is this is sort of a related theory about how all behaviors are performative. Whenever we're in any social interaction, we are trying to control the responses of our interlocutor, of our audience. So, for example, at the moment, I'm trying to perform my case that performance is an important category of human behavior, and you as an audience, I have to try and mold my speech in a performative way that tries to persuade you of these things that I'm telling you about. And the sociologist called Irving Goffman is perhaps responsible for making us realize just how integral this concept of performance is to all types of social interaction. So what's the point that I'm making here? Well, I'm making the point that there is an integral connection between what we might see as a theatrical practice that happens on stage, so your Bacchae or your frogs or your Oedipus Tyrannus, and other types of social practice or praxis. So what we do in everyday life are interactions with various people in society. And my final bullet point here, and the importance of this bullet point is belied by its size, is actually probably the most important bullet point in this slide. But this idea, and this is quite a modern idea, or certainly an idea that's sort of, in the headlines at the moment, as it were, but this idea of our own identity as a performed activity is one that is really, really important. So, for example, we'll talk in the next slide about gender, but our very identity is not something that is innate to us, but is in fact a performance, and adheres to a set of norms and canonical and sort of canonical attributes that you can perform rather than necessarily things that exist naturally within you from birth. Why is all this important? Well, ancient Greek drama, when you're looking at ancient Greek drama, you are seeing examples of people performing identities. So this, I mean, whilst the ancient Greeks might not have articulated the idea that identity creation is a form of performed activity, the very nature of going to an ancient Greek play and sitting in a theatre and watching people wearing masks and perform other identities should get people thinking about, would have got people thinking about the arbitrariness of identity and the fact that we can perform certain identities, and the fact that these aren't necessary. You know, we can perform other roles. I mean, that's the key point here. But theatrical performance sort of exposes the fact that humans can perform different roles and positionalities. All right, next slide, performance and the question of gender. And this is just sort of reiterating some of the things that I've said in the previous slide. But if identity, for example, gender is itself performative, then performance itself, so, people in the Bacchae, for example, is a powerful tool for the exploration of gender. It becomes an important way in which to explore how identity can be performed. Now, I think a really useful place to look for evidence of identity as role-playing is Aristophanic comedy. Because Aristophanic comedy is a venue in which characters often, for example, switch gender and explicitly play different characters. So Aristophanic comedy is a really interesting venue for thinking about performance as an exploration of identity and role-playing, especially as it relates to gender. The other important point here about ancient Greek drama is that all actors are male. So really, even at the institutional level, you've got male actors playing female characters. So even sort of before you have a particular play, people at the audience are turning up knowing that you've got male characters playing female roles. So even before you get to the play, there's this idea that gender is something that perhaps, is performable regardless of what gender you actually are. And the third important point here, it's the bugbear of much study about ancient Greek drama is, were women present in the audience or not? This makes a huge difference to, for example, watching a man playing a woman. A woman's reaction to this, a female audience member's reaction to this may differ from a male audience member's reaction to this. So this idea of this problematic question of whether women did constitute some of the ancient audience of the city Dionysia. I don't want to open this can of worms too much now. Women probably, there is certainly later evidence that women were in the audience, but it is a problematic question. But it is one that has serious implications for this question of performance as an identity on the Athenian stage. Okay, and so still, next slide. So still thinking about the importance of performance as it relates to a category of human behavior. There are some theories that consider performance as being deeply rooted in human origins. So for example, bullet point number 1 here, there is a theory that certain performative modes carry traces of early human activity. So, for example, agricultural festivals and initiation rituals. And this is especially important to, for example, Greek old comedy. I mean, one of the theories, maybe a slightly outmoded theory now, but I think it still has some traction. But one of the theories about Greek old comedy, so for example, Aristophanes, is that it does have its roots in early performative modes of human activity that are for example manifested in ancient agricultural festivals. So there's this idea that ancient Greek drama does actually originate from, you know, humans exploring their own performativity. And there are other theories that speak quite nicely to this. So, for example, Nietzsche's idea of performance as an expression of basic human impulses, or the French dramatist Artaud's theory that that movement and gesture in a theatrical context on stage actually provide a way of think or have a link to what humans have themselves repressed. So things that they won't do in everyday life, as it were, so not in the theatre. Gestures and movements on the theatre sort of are a way of expressing things that we have repressed in our everyday interactions. Okay. Life as performance. So what? Yeah. Okay. So performance as an important sort of category of human behavior. There were theories in the ancient world that life itself was a type of performance, and I've given us a couple of quotations here that articulate this quite nicely. So the first is from a Greek Stoic philosopher called Epictetus. And he basically, well, I'll read some of this quotation out. He says, remember, and he's talking to his human audience. He says, remember that you are an actor in a play. The sort of play is whatever the playwright or the god wishes. Short if he wants it short, long if he wants it long. ... To choose the role is another's job, i.e. the playwrights, the gods. For Oinomaus, the tragic actor, did not play Oedipus any better when he represented him as a king than when he represented him as at Colonus, a wanderer and a beggar. So here the important idea is that all of us as humans are in some sense performing our roles, are theatrically performing our roles as humans walking this earth. So again, this sort of comes back to this point that I'm trying to hammer home, that performance, just we need to be sort of self-conscious and critical about performance as a category of human activity. And then this second quotation, which is from Suetonius's Life of Augustus, this very famous quotation that comes from the end of his life, or rather the end of Augustus's, or rather the end of Suetonius's biography. And it's Augustus who characterizes life as having been a mime. And he says at the end, since well I've played my part, please all clap your hands, and from the stage dismiss me with applause. So it's this idea that he as Roman emperor has been playing a role on the stage, and that everyone else has been his audience. Okay, next slide. Representation versus reality. So again, this speaks to this question about what is performance and what is not. For us as humans walking the earth, when are we performing and when are we not? What is real and what is not real? So it's this question of what is representation and what is reality. And to what extent are we performing our roles as, for example, performing our roles as human beings, or as husbands or wives, or as whatever it might be? To what extent is all of this a performance? And I've given us a quotation that talks about an actor from the 4th century BC called Polus. And Polus's son has died in real life. But what happens next is really interesting, and I'll just read out this quotation. The plot of the play requires that Electra, who is represented as carrying her brother's remains, should lament and bewail the fate that she believed had overtaken him. Accordingly, Polus, i.e. the actor who's playing Electra, clad in the mourning garb of Electra, took from the tomb the ashes and urn of his son, embraced them as if they were those of Orestes, and filled the whole place and this is the important bit, not with the appearance and imitation of sorrow, but with genuine grief and unfeigning lamentation. Therefore, while it seemed that a play was being acted, it was in fact his real grief that was being enacted. So again, what this passage I think is sort of talking about is, to what extent is what we see on the stage, well, on the ancient Greek stage in this instance, to what extent is it real, and to what extent is it pretend, and to what extent are these categories actually more difficult to separate than we might otherwise have hitherto thought. Okay, so that's so those are my slides on this sort of category of performance. James or Anna, could you give me a sense of my time, how long I've got left? So I don't know what time James finished speaking. How long have I got left? I'll assume I've got about...
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes or so, and then time for Q&A after that.
Great, perfect. Okay, 15 minutes. Okay, so sorry, I've got, yes, I do have a couple of more slides on this idea about performance, and I'd just like to sort of home in on why it's an important question to ask. What is the difference? What is the distinction between a performance on the one hand and a textual incarnation of that performance? And I've listed some significant questions here. So, for example, how does a live performance differ from reading a textual version of that performance? What does a written document gain by being recited or acted out in front of an audience? Is it possible, for example, when we're reading a text, to elicit from it the sense of its live performance? Do we require certain different strategies of interpretation for a performance on the one hand, as opposed to a reading of the text on the other? So do we need to approach these things in different ways? And I've suggested in the last bullet point here that there is perhaps, we also need to think about this very practical problem of literacy rates, certainly in ancient Athens, where probably the literacy rates would have been, well, no more than maybe a quarter to a third. So people would have experienced these plays as performance pieces rather than necessarily have, reading them as textual events. The effects of performance. All right, I'm going to skip this slide, I think. Yeah.
Dan, don't worry too much about running on. We can always take a bit of time out of the Q&A or a little bit after the break. So don't feel you need to rush too much.
All right. Okay. Well, maybe I can come back to these slides, but I think I'm going to move on to what types of evidence do we actually have for ancient Greek drama. So I've been talking very conceptually about what we mean by performance and why, as students of ancient drama, we need to take the concept seriously and not approach it self-evidently. And as I say, some of this conversation is quite conceptual and relates to all types of performative modes rather than necessarily ancient Greek drama. But what I'd like to do now is move to the evidence that we have for ancient Greek drama specifically, and certainly looking at some of the evidence that you'll encounter in your the A-level syllabus for the Class Civ module. So I've listed sort of 4 general categories for the types of evidence that we have, and before I sort of read them out, I would just like to sort of make the quite basic methodological point about all of these types of evidence as being as important as each other. So it's very easy when we're in, if we're in the classroom reading these plays, to privilege the literary text over and above all the other contextual evidence that we have. And I'd just like to sort of extend the sort of warning that if we do that, we're missing we're missing much of the fun. We're missing much of the sort of interpretative potential of these texts if we don't also sort of try and situate them within their broader social and material context. So, bullet point 1, obviously we have the literary texts themselves. But even there, we still need to be aware of the vagaries of transmission. So, for example, very early on in the history of the textual transmission of some of these plays, and what I mean by that, so texts are copied down from one person to the next. Mistakes creep in, and not only mistakes creep in, but also, for example, ancient actors were known to sort of install soliloquies for themselves into the plays. So we need to sort of be aware that when we read these texts, whereas, I mean, by and large, they're probably, if we read Euripides' Bacchae, probably most of what we read is by Euripides. But we have to beware that, it's possible that actors had installed their own soliloquies and added various lines and things like that. So we just need to be aware that what we're reading, we are 2,500 years removed from it, and that things, that things may have crept in that weren't originally there. That brings with it the next methodological question about whether that matters and to what extent they this should influence our interpretation of them. But that's a conversation for another day. So then we have visual and iconographic evidence, and again, some of this is in the class civ syllabus. So, for example, vases. I know the Pronomos vases in the syllabus. Terracotta figurines. We have many hundreds surviving examples of these, and we also have mosaics, maybe from a later period, but we have mosaics. So again, so Greek drama as being the experience of Greek drama as being, recreated in other contexts. So terracotta figurines that people would put up on their, ancient equivalent of a mantelpiece, for example, or, put in someone's grave, for example, and mosaics. So, people would want to commemorate certain theatrical events. We also, now on the third bullet point, we also have the evidence of inscriptions, which offer us actually really key details about the dramatic productions. So these are, for example, called the fasti or the didascalii. So this gives us important information about, for example, who was awarded prizes and things like that. But the inscriptions are sort of a goldmine of evidence for ancient Greek drama that are sort of seldom really looked at properly. And then finally, we have, archaeological evidence of the actual remains of the theatres themselves. All right. So in terms of the literary text, so this is an example of a papyrus preserving some lines of the Orestes. And actually, we can see on this papyrus, we've actually got some musical notations, which would have told, which would have given indications about the music that would have accompanied this play. So this papyrus, which is from Euripides' Orestes, is a really sort of important bit of evidence for thinking about the music that would have accompanied these texts that we read in black and white print in books. But most papyri look a bit like this. So again, the reason why I've given this image is because our experience of looking at things on a page, especially if it's a papyrus like this, is very, very different from how we would experience, or how an ancient audience would have experienced a play on the stage, which would have had acoustic and visual elements rather than, just being read, being read on a papyrus or in as a literary event, as a literary phenomenon. Okay, some visual evidence now. So this, I can't quite remember if this vase is on the class civ syllabus, but it's a very well-known vase that probably depicts a moment in Aeschylus's Persians. But it's important because we can, for example, see on the left-hand side there what is Darius's tomb. So it's this idea that on the vases are depicted the types of props that would have been visible on stage. So again, this other types of evidence reminds us of, what the ancient audience might have seen in terms of the props on stage. This vase here is another very well known vase. Similar business. We see we can see, for example, the wooden stagings. We can see where those two individuals are standing on a type of raised stage, which is probably wooden. So here we have a representation on a vase of a representation of a theatrical performance. So it's sort of we're sort of doubly distant from the original event here, because we've got a mimesis, an imitation of an imitation, if you see what I mean. But we can also see, for example, a basket containing the actors' props, and we can see how, for example, the actors would have been costumed. So again, this speaks to my point that this contextual evidence, the material evidence, is really, really key in trying to bring alive for us the text that we read in the books. So similar business here. We have a tragic scene, which is it's been suggested that this is perhaps from Sophocles's Oedipus Tyrannus. So again, this is, you know, really important evidence for perhaps how people would have experienced an ancient tragic theatrical performance. We note here that in this tragic play, we don't have the grotesque comic masks. If we have time, I'll get to a slide that talks a little bit more about masks. But yeah, masks are an, you know, important category of evidence and for thinking about ancient Greek drama. Okay, I'm going to miss out the next couple of slides because they sort of repeat things I've already said. We have a mask down on the floor down here. So again, we've got a scene where you know, actors are sort of dressing before or after a performance. The famous Pronomos vase, which I'm sure is on your, which is on the syllabus. It's the sort of scene that depicts all manner of things that go on backstage. So again, really, really key evidence for the context of ancient drama and that kind of apparatus, the scaffolding of ancient Greek drama. Here's one of the mosaics I was talking about earlier as well. And I can whiz through these slides. These are just some figurines. Masks are, I think, masks are really interesting to think about, because again, if we're reading things on the page, we lose a sense of what it was to experience, for example, a tragical comic play in which actors were wearing masks. So these masks here, by the way, aren't actual masks. They're representations of theatrical masks, which we find in any number of contexts in the ancient world. But if I just go to this next slide, yeah, so I'd just like to talk for a moment about the importance of Greek theatrical masks. So the first point I'd like to make is that masks might seem alienating for a modern audience. So if we watch a reproduction of an ancient play and the actors are wearing masks, this is for us slightly alienating, because we're used to watching, you know, things on TV or, you know, films in the cinema or, you know, modern plays in which actors don't tend to wear masks. You know, this we usually see human faces. So for us, it's quite an alienating experience. And so we need to ask sort of self-critically and self-awarely, what did it mean for an ancient audience to experience actors wearing masks? So just to give you a bit of history on the masks, the first dramatist, who was called Thespis in the late 6th century BC, is said to have smeared his actors' faces with wine lees. So what wine lees? So I don't quite know what wine lees are. I think it's sort of the yeast that gathers after you fermented wine, but it's a white substance, and he was known to rub the actors' faces with wine lees, and this was sort of the origin of the idea that actors would wear masks, and he later introduced linen masks. But it's not entirely clear why. And there are some practical issues that attend this question of masks. I mean, so one answer to why the actors would wear masks is to allow a single actor to play multiple roles. because as we know, in ancient Greek drama, there was a limit to how many protagonists, or rather, sorry, how many actors could be on stage. So in the first instance, you only had a protagonist and deuteragonist, and this was later extended to a third actor. So a practical implication would be that a single actor could play multiple roles. Masks, and this is the next bullet point, masks were suggestive of character types rather than necessarily being individuals. So they'd be indices of, for example, your age or your gender or your class. But beyond that, the audience would need to make interpretative choices. The audience would need to interpret what was going on based on gesture and plot and action, rather than necessarily making out what the facial expression was. So in this sense, and this is the final bullet point on this page, masks blur the distinction between individuals and instead focus on collective identity. And this is, again, really important in a democracy. I mean, we've already talked about democracy as being sort of linked to performance, insofar as in a democracy, people need to be able to perform and persuade. But masks also play into the importance of democracy, because a democracy is about collective identity. It's about, in some ways, it's about the sacrificing, individual well-being for the good of the whole. So masks, have been argued to play into this, this democratic idea in which collective identity is really, really important. I'm aware that it's now 1:30. I've reached a natural isthmus. If James or Anna, you thought we should move on to questions, what do you think?
Dan, I think I think you could, let's say, talk for another at least 5 minutes or so if you wanted to, and then we can. I mean, there's only currently one content related question, so while we give people a chance to build up their questions, do keep on going.
Righty ho. Okay, so we've had a lot of context and we've got a little bit more context, but I'd like now to think about the historical context of 5th century BC drama. So what is that context? Well, all of the drama that we have was produced in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, namely the defeat of Persia by the Allied force in 479 BC. So the first fully extant play that we have is produced 8 years after that Persian defeat, and that's in 471, and it's Aeschylus's Persians. So that's a sort of historical backdrop of early 5th century BC drama. But a lot of the drama that we do have, so for example, later plays of Sophocles or Euripides, is written under the sort of shadow, under the cloud of the Peloponnesian War, which was basically a war between various warring Greek city-states, under Athens on the one side and under Sparta on the other. So the important point that I guess I'm making here is that most extant Athenian drama is composed either in the wake of the Persian Wars or during the Peloponnesian Wars. Now I know Edith in her talk is going to talk about violence in Bacchae, Oedipus and frogs, but I guess I'd like to raise raise the spectre of violence here and just say that the 5th century BC in terms of conflict was a violent context. And we need to consider, to what extent that violence has filtered onto the genre, the performative mode that we call ancient Greek drama. And this brings with it the sort of related methodological question about the extent to which we should historicize Athenian drama. And what I mean by historicize there is the extent to which we should read historical events into dramas which are so clearly set in the Bronze Age mythical world. To what extent has the Peloponnesian War, for example, to what extent has the Peloponnesian War infiltrated Greek drama? I mean, I know it rears its head, for example, in Aristophanes' Frogs. You know, we're reaching the end of the war, and how to end the war becomes a very pertinent question in that play. And it's as if sort of history and politics and war intrude into this what, you know, this sort of, you know, this dramatic space in a way that is very interesting indeed. And old comedy, you know, comedy is different from tragedy in that regard. Comedy allows politics and history to intrude in a way that tragedy doesn't, or certainly tragedy doesn't do it as explicitly. So yeah, the historical background of Greek drama is sort of important, sort of methodological, sort of, you know, question that we need to face when reading any of these texts.